if you assume any rate of improvement at all, then the games will become indistinguishable from reality.
Simulation technology is getting better and better.
What I'm going to try and do is convince you you're a simulation and that physics can prove it.
1 in a zillion, you're the real universe, and 999 bazillion to 1
that you're a simulation.
That convinced me.
Starts to seem much more likely that I'm simulated. There are so many more simulated beings. The odds are tiny that I would be unsimulated.
Well, maybe we're in a simulation right now.
Humanity has long obsessed over what is real. Whether it be the shadows on Plato's cave or the butterfly dream of Zhuangzhou, we've often toyed with the idea that our senses might be deceiving us. But these philosophical musings, really more than intellectual titillation, have now evolved into a pointed assault on our very concept of reality, thanks to the modern computing era.
This isn't real. What is real? How do you define real? If you're talking about what you can feel, what you can smell, what you can taste and see, then real is simply electrical signals interpreted by your brain.
In its latest incarnation, now deftly dressed as a scientific argument, proponents suggest that our reality may be nothing more than a computer simulation, that what we call the universe is, in fact, merely a computer program running within some inaccessible reality above us. You've been living in a dream world. It was philosopher Nick Bostrom who formalized the so-called simulation argument in 2003, around the same time that the Matrix sequels were released. Bostrom suggested that one of 3 hypotheses must be true, 3 doors of possibility. Door 1 is that we will never be able to simulate conscious beings on a computer. Perhaps we somehow destroy ourselves before that transpires. Not the most attractive option. Door 2, we can simulate reality, but for some reason, we just never choose to. This is perhaps the least plausible option. Humanity has never refrained from utilizing the technology at its disposal. Door 3, we will one day simulate reality, and thus we should consider the possibility that we are ourselves simulated. What differentiates the simulation hypothesis from the early philosophical skepticism of Plato and others is that this isn't just some cute philosophical idea. This is a practical goal for many computer scientists today, and you only need to look at the computer game industry to see why. In 1972, one of our best simulations of reality would be what we would now consider an extremely crude depiction of a table tennis game. Today, computer games approach photorealistic quality with ray tracing and sophisticated physics engines. And so in another few decades, these advances in computer graphics and immersion technology could become so advanced that we wouldn't be able to tell the difference between reality and a game. Maybe we wouldn't want to. The idea of a simulated reality was, of course, popularized in the Matrix films from 1999 to 2003, but it has recently resurfaced into public discourse and media headlines, thanks to, in no small part, the tech billionaire Elon Musk. In interviews, Elon Musk has shared his belief that the probability that we are not living in a simulation is 1 in billions, a near certainty.
The odds that we're in base reality is 1 in billions.
Now, the credibility and authority that Elon Musk's name carries in the field of technology is enough to persuade many bystanders that he is likely right, that our reality is nothing more than a simulation. This reasoning can be summarized as follows. As computer games advance in sophistication, we will eventually be capable of simulating conscious beings inside computers, and could indeed launch billions of such simulations containing trillions of conscious entities. And so, against this backdrop of vast numbers of simulated intelligences, the chances are that you were born as a simulated consciousness rather than as a real one. When proponents describe that argument, It sounds very convincing. After all, there's no doubt that at the present day, computer games are indeed increasing in sophistication. And if we could one day simulate a reality, then why would we stop at one? Why wouldn't we do billions of the things? So, does this effectively prove that we are indeed living in a simulation? Are you nothing more than a piece of computer code? And what does it mean for our lives if that is true?
Right now, we're inside a computer program.
Is it really so hard to believe?
When we first encountered the simulation hypothesis, many of us might feel an initial sense of despair. Our entire lives are nothing more than lines of code running on a computer. It means that we're all impotent. Nothing we really do matters. Irrespective of how great our accomplishments are, none of them occurred in the real world. But, on the other hand, one might question whether that state of affairs is really any different from a non-simulated reality. The universe is billions of years old, and will persist for trillions more. We occupy such an insignificant speck of existence that aren't we already impotent? If the universe is simulated, then at the finest level of detail, all we would find would be information, ones and zeros. But ultimately, even in a natural universe, the fundamental building blocks might indeed just be information too. Are these ideas really so different? Does it really matter if we're simulated at all? I think many people in recent years have made that case quite persuasively, but I think there are still fundamental differences between these two ideas that make them quite distinct. First off, consider this. If you are simulated, then your memories may very well be simulated too. Your childhood, your friendships, your mistakes, your successes, and even the ones you love would be nothing more than an implanted memory. Even your age could be just an illusion. You could have been created just last year, deceived into thinking you had experiences that you'd never experienced. Indeed, you may have come into existence just a few moments ago, ironically born to watch a YouTube video about how your life may be nothing more than an illusion, almost like an orientation bootcamp to prepare you for your new simulated existence. A second disturbing possibility is that almost no one you've ever met is even conscious. They're just NPCs populating the program, simulacra emulating intelligent conversations, but not truly comprehending anything around them. René Descartes would say that all you can be sure of is that you think, therefore you exist, but everything else is up for grabs, even me. Now, these possibilities are technically true in a natural universe as well, but they become far more elaborate enterprises to orchestrate, whereas in a simulated reality, it's as simple as a few lines of code. And when it comes to your code, who you are, a third possibility is that you are not unique. This may be the second time your program has been run, or the third, or the fourth, or the millionth. Each time the memories are wiped, the initial conditions reset and the simulation started once again. This is actually something we do all the time in physics simulations. There is an inherent randomness to events and initial conditions, and slight changes can lead to complex differences down the road, like the butterfly effect. And so, to explore these, we often perturb the simulations just slightly and repeat, which makes you wonder how many times you have lived this life, ended up here, watching this video. Digital reincarnation. I think then there are some reasons why one could argue that it really does matter if our existence is nothing more than a simulation. While the kind of skeptical questions I've posed here certainly predate the simulation concept, the simulation idea makes them more accessible, more straightforward to conceive of in their execution. Ultimately, whether this disturbs you or not is going to be a personal question, and it's not going to be one that we all agree upon. If we accept Elon Musk's 1,000,000,000 probability, much of humanity's future might be spent wrestling with what it means to be simulated. But do other thought leaders agree with this grim assessment? What counter-arguments to the simulation hypothesis might exist? Over the last few years, physicists have pushed back against the simulation hypothesis from a few different angles. At the most extreme end, there are some who argue that scientists should not even waste their time thinking about this, as this isn't really science.
I'm curious not so much about the question of whether we're a simulation, but I actually am very interested in why so many people think it's an interesting question.
A reason behind this is that there's no experiment that we could ever design that could 100% prove that we are not living in a simulation. And therefore the idea is unfalsifiable and thus leaves the arena of traditional science. Now, personally, I can accept that this might not be how we would define science in the traditional sense, but nevertheless, I think the idea is interesting to scientists because it concerns the very fundamental nature of the universe, of our reality, and those are questions that we care about deeply. Now, I want to add that not all scientists agree that the idea is untestable, and some are even attempting to design experiments to test the simulation hypothesis. However, it is important to distinguish between testing whether the universe is built upon the principles of computation, but is not a simulation, versus testing whether the universe is indeed a simulation on someone's computer. Those are different to each other. It is quite possible that the laws of computation are somehow embedded within nature, and yet everything we see around us is not a simulation. A basic premise behind much of the simulation experimental concepts is that the simulation we inhabit cannot be perfect. Errors will be present, either by mistake of the coder or just because of the finite computational power of the creator. Perhaps then, if we zoom in to the fine detailed structure of matter and energy, we would uncover some errors in the code, digital structure, approximations betraying its falseness. After all, if you wanted to simulate the entire universe to exact precision, then you would need a computer that was the mass of the universe. However, for me, there is a big problem with this approach, and that's that the simulators don't have to simulate the entire universe. They only have to simulate our perceptions of it. Consider an open world computer game with a vast landscape and different regions to explore. The game does not render the entire universe, the entire landscape to the highest degree of fidelity at each moment. Rather, it just generates what the player can see in each instant. And so when we pull out our microscopes and look deep into an object's composition, perhaps even down to the subatomic level, it is only in those moments that the simulators need recreate the fine structure, a far less taxing enterprise. And taking this idea a little bit further, we can say that the simulators don't even need to simulate the subatomic particles themselves. They only need to simulate our perception of them, what our eyes see, what our brain interprets. And so in this way, the simulators have a far easier task at hand. And yet more, they might have vastly richer computational resources at their disposal than we can possibly imagine. And finally, even if an error does creep in occasionally, the simulator doesn't have to invoke deja vu. They could of course just pull the clock back, reload the last save game, and correct the bug such that you never remember that you saw it. Together then, I just don't buy the idea that we should expect errors in the code. No matter what we do, we will always be rats in the maze. If physics can't save us from simulated doom, then what about logic? Well, friend of the channel Professor Sean Carroll pointed out an interesting contradiction in the simulation argument that might just save us, and it goes like this. If simulated realities are possible, then the simulations could themselves launch their own simulations, and those could launch more, and so on and so forth, forming a kind of Inception-style hierarchy of reality. Furthermore, if we're simulated, then that would mean that the first two possibilities of Bostrom's trilemma were clearly false. In other words, yes, it is possible to simulate conscious beings, and yes, civilizations sometimes choose to do so. Now here comes the problem. Given the hierarchical structure of reality which fans ever wider and wider, it turns out that most of the civilizations will end up living in this bottom level of reality. Now, computational resources and capabilities have to diminish with each level, and so the lowest level would represent a level for which it was impossible to ever build a computer capable of simulating reality. Okay, so did you catch that? There's the contradiction. If the simulation argument is true and there's this hierarchy of realities, then we most likely live at the bottom level of reality where it's not possible to simulate reality. And yet, the very premise of the argument is that it is possible to simulate reality, a contradiction. Carroll's contradiction is subtle and clever, but personally, I don't quite buy it. My take is that even if we do live in the bottom level of reality, and would thus never be able to simulate realities ourselves, it's not unreasonable that we would still consider this as a possibility. We would still come up with Bostrom's trilemma, and thus it would act to dissolve the contradiction. These lowest level realities might still be capable of creating rather impressive simulations, just not ones quite sophisticated enough to simulate conscious beings on a computer. Nevertheless, they might still consider this a reasonable possibility, given that they are themselves working on the precipice of that technology. And so, I don't agree that a contradiction necessarily exists here. A final counter-argument I highlight comes from a recent book by William Poundstone. This was recently discussed by Neil deGrasse Tyson during a Star Talk episode, who was quite convinced by it, and even led popular sci-tuber Carl Hill to suggest that Neil had solved the simulation argument. All that aside, I recommend picking up a copy of the book for yourself and reading it, making up your own mind on this, but for the sake of conciseness, I will provide here a brief summary of the counter-argument. Go to the theatre or the movies one night and watch what is in effect a simulation of another world. When are they simulating? Most of the time, the movie takes place around the modern era, be it a thriller, a romance, horror, political drama, or a comedy. Sometimes, but not as often, it is set a few hundred years in the future, especially in science fiction. Likewise, a minority of movies are set a few hundred years in the past, such as period dramas or historical pieces. But it's rare that the story takes place thousands of years in the past or thousands of years in the future. Typically, the story focuses on the modern era more or less. Now, William Poundstone argues that the creators of these simulated realities would also prefer to generate simulations of more or less their modern era, not temporally distant ones. And so, if we imagine a civilization achieving computational supremacy and one that lasts for thousands of years beyond that achievement, simulation technology would be a normal tool of their society, like our smartphones are to us. And thus, most of these simulations would be set in nearly concurrent times, eras when simulation technology was itself widespread. On that basis, the fact that we live in an era that does not possess widespread simulation technology, that becomes an important feature of our very existence. We would be an example of their most ancient simulations, which Poundstone considers to be rare. It's a thoughtful argument, and it's one that convinced Neil deGrasse Tyson.
There's 1 in a zillion you're the real universe, and 999 zillion to 1 that
you're a simulation.
And I was just begging for somebody to give me an argument that was cogent enough to undermine that entire reasoning, and I just came across one.
However, I have to say it doesn't convince me. A problem with this argument is that it makes a fair few assumptions. For example, it's not obvious to me that this assumption of preferentially simulating concurrent eras would persist for a highly advanced post-human civilization. For instance, they might crave simulating simpler eras than that of their own. Or they might even prefer to simulate pre-simulation technology civilizations in order to prevent a hierarchical runaway of realities within realities. Ultimately, trying to guess the mind and actions of these advanced simulator civilizations is as speculative as trying to guess the mind of an advanced alien civilization. Further, it tacitly assumes that the parent civilization will last for a very long time, many thousands of years. Now, that's not an unreasonable assumption to make, but it's also a fairly specific one upon which to base one's conclusions. If the create a civilization only lasts for a couple of hundred years past today, then it wouldn't be so unusual or strange for them to be simulating the year 2020. So this argument is clever, it's thoughtful, but for me, I don't buy it as a slam dunk demonstration that the simulation hypothesis can't be true. It's just a little bit too assumption loaded for my taste. So where does that leave us? Despite everything said, all these possible counter-arguments, the simulation hypothesis remains viable. Could Elon Musk be right then? Are the odds indeed 1 in a billion that this is real?
It would seem to follow that the odds that we're in base reality is 1 in billions. Tell me what's wrong with that argument.
It was at this point in our story that I decided to enter the fray, and I'm happy to say I have now got a new research paper published on this topic. What always struck me as suspicious with Elon Musk's conclusion of billions to 1 odds is that it's very rare in science that we have such high confidence in our theories, even when we have overwhelming amounts of data. But here, we have basically no data. So something about that just didn't look right. Before getting into my new work, let's walk through how one might arrive at the billion to 1 odds. Musk assumes that simulations will one day become sufficiently sophisticated to emulate reality in brains, door 3 of Bostrom's trilemma. Let's say that this circle here represents the base reality, the so-called real world. After developing this technology, they go on to spawn many new realities represented by the shapes below. We can also imagine that these also spawn their own realities, forming a hierarchy, but this isn't really a necessity to what follows. The real point is that the number of simulated realities will surely greatly outnumber the one single true reality. Let's just accept one simple fact. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. That's all we know. And what that tells us is that we must live in one of these shapes, but it could be any of them. Throw a dart at this myriad of realities and you will almost certainly land in a simulated reality. And thus, by this reasoning, the probability that we live in base reality is 1 billion to 1 or worse, a calculation that comes from simply counting realities. In fact, whenever inference depends on counting like this, we would describe this as a frequentist approach to statistics. Now, frequentism is great when you know what the right model is. Here, Elon Musk's model is that the ability and decision to one day simulate conscious beings on a computer is inevitable. It's door 3 of Bostrom's trilemma. It's so sneaky and subtle that you probably don't even really think of it as being a model, but truly, that is what this calculation is predicated upon. An alternative school of statistics exists though, known as Bayesianism. It really encompasses the frequentist thinking, but allows us to calculate the probability of competing models themselves, and then even average probabilities accounting for model uncertainty. In our case, there are really just 2 hypotheses to consider. On the one hand, we have the simulation hypothesis, a universe in which civilizations can and do simulate conscious beings on a computer, shutting the first 2 doors of Bostrom's trilemma shut, just as Elon Musk assumes. On the other hand, we have the null hypothesis, a scenario in which one of Bostrom's first 2 possibilities holds true, that our reality is real. For whatever reason, we will never simulate conscious beings on a computer. It doesn't really matter whether this is by choice or by capability, because the outcome is the same, and so we will group these 2 possibilities into just one hypothesis. Okay, so in Bayesian inference, we start by asking what is the probability of getting the data given each model. In our case, the only real data we have is cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. So, for both hypotheses, the probability of obtaining that data given each model is 100%. That means that the odds ratio between the 2 hypotheses is 50-50, even odds. And so, very simply, on that basis, one might conclude that there is a 50-50 odds that we are simulated. But that's not quite the full story, because here all I've done is weigh these two hypotheses against one another, and that's not quite the same thing as asking what is the probability that we live in base reality. And that is because in the simulation hypothesis, at the very top of this hierarchy, there is a small possibility that we are still living in base reality. That's Elon Musk's 1,000,000,000 probability. Mathematically, that 1,000,000,000 should really be equal to 1 divided by the number of simulated realities plus 1, where that plus 1 is the one true reality. For the null hypothesis, the probability that we live in base reality is simply 1, since no other realities exist. We now have all of the pieces we need, and we just need to combine them together. The probability that we live in base reality equals the probability that we live in base reality under the null hypothesis, multiplied by the relative probability of the null hypothesis, plus the probability that we live in base reality under the simulation hypothesis, multiplied by the relative probability of the simulation hypothesis being correct. Going through the math, one finds that the probability that we live in base reality is 1/2 plus this little extra term. Critically, that little extra term is always greater than 0. And so this means that the probability that we live in base reality is always greater than 50%. In other words, chances are this is real. A subtle assumption in that calculation is the principle of indifference. I have assumed that the two hypotheses are equally likely a priori. This is often attributed to the French polymath Pierre-Simon Laplace. In the absence of any other information, we assume that all possibilities are equally likely. As an example, if you're trying to guess whether you'll prefer Pepsi or Cola and have never tasted either before, it's fair to assign even odds to the two possibilities. That's the principle of indifference. So, whilst I would give you better than even odds that our reality is real, Musk would give you 1 in a billion odds that it is not. The difference between these two really stems from the use of Bayesian inference and this principle of indifference. Musk doesn't assume indifference, he assumes absolute certainty that we will one day simulate conscious beings on a computer. And to me, that is just too strong of an assumption to make. And yes, I agree that computers and virtual reality are advancing at impressive rates, but simulating conscious beings is a very different kettle of fish to just making nice graphics. There may be deep and insurmountable technical challenges ahead of us that prevent a true consciousness from ever being simulated. We simply don't know because no one's ever done it. That's why Laplace's principle of indifference is appropriate, just as with the example of Pepsi and Cola. Now, some of you might point out that cogito ergo sum is certainly true, but it's not the only data that we have in hand. In particular, we know that we ourselves have not yet spawned simulated realities. This is really what Sean Carroll was getting at in his contradiction argument, and was also highlighted in Neil's Star Talk show recently. A reality which has not spawned its own simulated realities can be described as nulliparous. Does adding in our nulliparous nature into the Bayesian statistical inference I described earlier change the conclusions? Do we get a different answer? Turns out not. Still, the odds come out about the same as before. But why? Well, consider a hierarchy of simulated realities. Each one is either parous, represented by the circles, or nulliparous, represented by the squares, given by some probability p. Let's say that if they are parous, then they generate X children. Continuing this chain for many levels, one finds that the majority of simulations exist at the lowest level, the sewer of reality. These are realities which by definition are nulliparous, just like ourselves. In fact, the probability of being in the sewer is shown in my paper to be 1 minus 1 over px. So, for example, with values of p equals 0.5 and x of 100, that would represent a 98% probability. What this means is that the fact that we are ourselves a nulliparous civilization is in no way inconsistent with the simulation hypothesis. In fact, is the expected outcome of the simulation hypothesis. This strikes in the opposite chord to the argument made by William Poundstone earlier. What it means is that when we rerun this calculation, nothing really changes. We end up getting about the same answer as before, and that is that we are most likely living in base reality. But here comes the kicker. For the example values I gave you before, 98% of the simulations are in the sewer and are thus nulliparous. So the other 2% are in higher levels, some of which are parous and some of which are not. Using the values from before, we'd expect to end up with 1% of the realities being parous in total. So, what if one day in the near future we invent the technology to simulate conscious beings? That would mean that we are now a parous reality. We have become one of the 1%. Yet more, that fact immediately excludes the null hypothesis, since that strictly assumes that simulations will never happen. And so, in this case, we would conclude that we either live in the base reality, which is parous, or one of the mid-level parous realities. And whilst those only make up 1% of the total is still potentially huge, billions of simulations. And so on that basis, you would most likely conclude that we are simulated. And so let me say that one more time, just to be totally clear. If we ever develop the technology to simulate conscious beings on a computer, then the statistics flip. It in fact becomes highly likely that we are currently living in a simulation. And so we can imagine on this grand day when scientists are celebrating their own genius, chinking champagne glasses, that you might be stood at the back of the room, staring upon them with a dark consequence dawning upon you, that nothing is likely real. It is at this point that our journey ends. Whilst none of the previous counter-arguments convince me that we are not living in a simulation, my own research paper on this topic finds better than 50% odds that we are living in a non-simulated base reality. So it is still possible that we're living in a simulation, but chances are we're not. Hey, I can live with that. But remember, a single invention in the future would flip those odds 180. The simulation argument might be able to resist our physical experiments, but is not able to escape our mathematical and logical reasoning. Look, whether you're a piece of computer code or real, simulacra or physical, conscious entities are conscious or the same. You are self-aware, you are sentient, and that makes you amazing. So, until the next video, stay thoughtful and stay curious. Thank you so much for watching, everybody. This video was actually based on a real research paper that was produced by my team, the Cool Worlds Lab at Columbia University, and you too can now help support our research efforts by clicking the link somewhere up around here. Just like Lasse Skov and Chuck Wolfred, our latest 2 donors. Thank you so much, guys, for your support. We really appreciate it. So until next time, have a great day and see you around the cosmos.